Over 4,000 Indigenous children are believed to have died in Canada's residential schools, their graves often left unmarked, their names lost to history. These grim discoveries are not just numbers, they represent stolen lives, broken families, and a community scarred by systemic oppression. Yet, these numbers are merely the ones we know of. Thousands more children vanished without a trace, their stories untold, and their suffering unacknowledged. This is the legacy of Canada's residential school system, a chapter in history that demands our attention, empathy, and action. For more than a century, between the 1880s and the late 1990s, Canada's residential schools were a tool of forced assimilation. Established by the Canadian government and operated primarily by Christian churches, these institutions sought to civilize Indigenous children by eradicating their cultural identities. The system was built on the premise that Indigenous ways of life were inferior and that salvation could only be achieved by adopting Euro-Canadian culture and religion. But behind this facade of education lay harrowing stories of cultural genocide, abuse, and neglect. Children were forcibly taken from their families, often through coercion or direct intervention by authorities. Many parents resisted, only to face legal consequences or the threat of starvation as their livelihoods were targeted. These children, some as young as 3 or 4 years old, were thrust into environments alien to them, stripped of everything familiar: family, language, traditions, and even their names. The schools imposed strict rules, punishing children for speaking their native languages or practicing their cultural traditions. The penalties were harsh beatings, isolation, or worse. The harsh conditions extended beyond cultural oppression. Many schools were overcrowded and underfunded, resulting in appalling living conditions. Children were malnourished and poorly clothed, leaving them vulnerable to illnesses like tuberculosis and pneumonia. The mortality rates were alarmingly high, yet these deaths were often ignored or covered up. In some cases, parents were never informed of their child's death, leaving them to grieve without closure. Phyllis Webstad's story captures the personal heartbreak of this system. At 6 years old, she arrived at a residential school wearing a bright orange shirt gifted by her grandmother, a symbol of love and familial bond. That shirt was taken away from her on the first day, leaving her with nothing but a uniform and a deep sense of loss. For Phyllis, that orange shirt came to represent the erasure of identity and culture experienced by thousands of Indigenous children. Her story inspired Orange Shirt Day, an annual commemoration of the resilience of survivors and a call to remember the children who never came home. While individual accounts like Phyllis's provide a glimpse into the lived experiences of these children, the broader scale of this tragedy became undeniable with the discovery of unmarked graves. In May 2021, the remains of 215 children were found at the site of the former Kamloops Indian Residential School in British Columbia. This discovery shocked Canada and the world, forcing a national reckoning with the horrors of the residential school system. But Kamloops was just the beginning. Since then, over 1,300 unmarked graves have been uncovered across various residential school sites. These findings confirm what many Indigenous communities have long known, that the true extent of the system's brutality was systematically buried. These graves are silent witnesses to lives cut short and serve as stark reminders of the institutional violence endured by Indigenous children. The uncovering of these graves has reignited calls for justice and accountability. Indigenous communities have demanded proper burials for these children, along with reparations and support for survivors. The Canadian government has taken steps, such as offering formal apologies and establishing the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, TRC. The TRC documented the testimonies of over 6,000 survivors, shedding light on the abuses they endured and their lasting impact on Indigenous families and communities. The TRC's findings paint a grim picture of systemic neglect and abuse. It labeled the residential school system as cultural genocide, acknowledging the deliberate attempt to destroy Indigenous cultures and assimilate children into a foreign way of life. While the TRC offered 94 calls to action to address these injustices, progress has been slow. Many survivors feel that apologies and symbolic gestures are not enough. They seek concrete actions to repair the damage and prevent such atrocities from happening again. The legacy of residential schools is a wound that continues to ache within Indigenous communities. The trauma inflicted by these institutions has been passed down through generations, manifesting in struggles with mental health, addiction, and identity. Yet, these communities also exhibit remarkable resilience. Through cultural revitalization programs, language preservation efforts, and healing initiatives, Indigenous peoples are reclaiming their identities and asserting their rights. It is important to remember that this story is not just about the past. It is about acknowledging ongoing systemic inequalities and the need for continued advocacy. Education is a crucial part of this process. By learning about the history and impact of residential schools, Canadians and the global community can better understand the struggles of Indigenous peoples and support their efforts toward healing and justice. The discovery of unmarked graves and the testimonies of survivors have sparked global attention, but the work is far from over. There are still more schools to investigate, more graves to uncover, and more stories to document. Each discovery adds to the collective understanding of what happened and reinforces the urgency of addressing its aftermath. As individuals, we can play a part in this journey of reconciliation. By listening to survivors, amplifying their voices, and supporting Indigenous-led initiatives, we can help create a society that respects and values Indigenous cultures. We must also hold governments and institutions accountable for fulfilling their promises and implementing the TRC's calls to action. In the words of Murray Sinclair, former chair of the TRC, education got us into this mess, and education will get us out. Understanding the truth about Canada's residential schools is not just an act of remembrance, it is a step toward justice and a better future. What are your thoughts on this harrowing chapter of history? Share your reflections in the comments below. Let us know what stories of resilience and justice you'd like us to explore next. Together, we can honor the voices of the forgotten, amplify the resilience of survivors, and advocate for a world where no culture or child is ever silenced again. This is not just a history lesson. It is a call to action.